Hello, guys, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 8, a Masterclass interview with Rachel Scheller. Hello, guys, and welcome back to the Inked Podcast. This week, we are wrapping up our second season of this show, in which we have discussed everything involving our plot. But today, like with Season 1, since it is our last episode, we have a very special guest with us, Miss Rachel Scheller. I think that's how you say your last name. If I'm wrong, please correct me. Joining us so that I can ask her some questions that have been submitted by some of our writer friends. So thank you for coming on, Rachel. How are you doing today? And did I say your name right? I have no idea if I did or not.
Yeah, I'm doing fantastic. Very happy to be here. I generally pronounce it Scheller, but I know there's other people with the name that pronounce it differently, so no worries there.
Okay, I got you. Okay, I'll make a note because I originally thought it was Scheller, but like so many people say it so many different ways that I was like,
Mhm.
I don't know if that's right or not. Um, Well, I am so glad to have you here today, Rachel. But before we jump into our interview, I want to give our listeners just a little bit of background as to who you are. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Rachel and her work, Rachel is an author who loves to write fiction that makes you feel almost like you're watching a superhero movie. And she does that in one of her most popular pieces of work, her illustrated series, The Extension Squad, which you can find a sneak peek of, as well as more about Rachel and her work on her website, rmscheller.com. Rachel is also an instructor on the Young Writers Workshop, which is where I originally met her and reached out to her about being on the podcast. And I've just gotten to glean so much awesome and helpful advice from her by the things that she's taught. And so I'm just really excited to have her here today. So now that you guys know just a little bit more about Rachel and her work, which I highly recommend you go out and read, I just finished reading her first book in the Extension Squad, and I enjoyed it immensely. But now that you know a little bit more about her, Miss Rachel, are you ready to jump into the questions that have been submitted for today?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, our first question for today was actually one that was sent not by a writer, it was actually suggested by my mom. And this I'm going to give a little bit of context to just because it's a little more based on your work with the Young Writers Workshop. So, just a little bit of context as to what Miss Rachel does on the Young Writers Workshop. She manages the community, which is awesome, and she just keeps us all really safe, and we all really appreciate it. But my mom actually wanted to know, how do you go about managing as many of the people as you manage? Because you go around the community and you keep the kids really safe, and you have these big decisions of who are you trusting to be part of the community. So how do you just I don't know, it's not a very pointed specific question, so I apologize for that, but just how do you manage that every day?
hmm I think the big thing here is really delegation as well as having strong guidelines in place. The delegation piece, for context for any listeners who don't know, there are about, I'd say, 1,200 students who are currently using the community. And we have over 100 student leaders who take on different roles and help run things. There are also 3 other staff members who are dedicated specifically to the community, and they do different tasks, and they help me manage the student leaders. And I stand corrected. It's not about 100. The 100 student leaders is the ones that I interact with more, but then there are even more student leaders beyond that doing different sorts of roles. So one of the key things is, if I was trying to manage 1,200 students all on my own, I would definitely flail around and not do very much. But as the case is, having other staff members who oversee teams of student leaders, and having these teams of student leaders who each have their own wheelhouse and the things that they do and the ways that they're learning and growing in their leadership skills as they're doing this, that makes all the difference in being able to have a controlled environment that is conducive for everybody to learn. And then the other thing is just having the strong guidelines in place. By the time I took on this role, those guidelines already were in place, and I sometimes work on them, fine tune them a little bit. but just having these guidelines in place so that everybody knows what are the expectations. And we can also be alert in terms of keeping people safe. We can be alert to any behavior that falls outside our expected boundaries and know, okay, that's a red flag because that falls outside our community guidelines or just the way that we would expect people to behave. And really just having those sets of guidelines gives us the structure and the framework that we need to keep it a great learning environment and to keep everybody safe.
Mm-hmm. That's actually really helpful in my current situation because first of all, I know that as a student of White Ups, we definitely appreciate you like managing as well as you do and trusting the people that you do. Because when I first joined, I was actually reached out to by like some welcome leaders from the fellowships and also like a couple CAs, which are community assistants. They kind of help Rachel manage everything. And they were really helpful. And like, I just appreciate them so much. We actually have had a couple CAs or we will have a couple. Again, I have said this so many times. I record these out of order. We have actually had a couple of the CAs record with me already, so you might get to hear some of this from their perspective in future episodes. But yeah, that definitely is helpful and definitely makes a lot of sense. So, our next question goes a little more towards your writing, and especially when it comes to the extension squad, which is what made you want your stories to have like illustrations?
Yeah, I would say the inspiration behind the illustrations is that I am a big fan of graphic novels and specifically manga as well as anime. I just really enjoy seeing not only a story that's played out visually, but specifically how an art style can really influence how people see or think about characters, as well as that dynamic that having a visual element can bring to a story. One of my favorite story formats is light novels, where a very popular book format in Japan amongst young people, where it's often fairly similar to an anime or a manga. In fact, it's often like companion material to that. But and then it has these anime or manga like illustrations to it, and I just really enjoy that blend. So it's very much inspired by manga as well as light novels.
Got you. That makes a lot of sense. I understand that. I also, in reading your stories, I'm partially a visual learner. I'm not a ton of a visual learner, but it was really cool to get to see those illustrations and kind of understand the descriptions of the characters. So, like, that's kind of why I really liked getting to see your illustrations. Um, so speaking of illustrations, but going into a little bit more about your illustrator, um, somebody wanted to know how did you originally meet your illustrator, Miss Heather Rose?
We met back in 2016. We were on the same How to Train Your Dragon fan site together, and we got to know each other through fandom things. And then she also had her original characters and she would share pictures of them, and she would sometimes share bits of her writing. And she's actually the person who first introduced me to the Young Writers Workshop, because before I was staff there, I was a student there for several years. And she joined the Young Writers Workshop as soon as it started in 2017. And she kept talking about this place that's full of crazy writers and how great it is. And I could see the leaps and bounds she was making forward in her writing progress. And I was like, I have got to do that. And so I joined about 2 years after that. And yeah, so we met on a fandom site. She introduced me to the Young Writers Workshop. And we've both been learning and growing in our writing and our art, but she is definitely much further than me in the art journey.
Yeah, I totally get that. I'm not an artist myself. My friends do a lot of like drawings of my characters and everything just because they want to. And I'm like, I wish I cannot do that. So going into a little bit, I know I said that you really like to write stories that almost make you feel like you're like watching a superhero movie or watching like your favorite anime. So what triggered you understanding that writing superhero style books was like what you wanted to do?
I would say it's just from watching the Marvel Cinematic Universe a lot. Uh, My Hero Academia is also a huge inspiration for me, but it really started with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and also some of the Spider Man cartoons that I watched when I was younger. I just really enjoy the way that superhero stories can really lean into, okay, you have these dire situations, but then also the dire situations can often bring out emotions in a really powerful way. And I think that's a really cool combo of those action scenes as well as those emotions. And I think one of the big things that's driven me crazy with superhero things is, I mean, some of them are awesome and they have amazing themes, and I love it. They also tend to have some content that it's like, wow, I really wish it didn't necessarily have so much language, or I wish, it wouldn't sexualize the female characters so much, or I wish that maybe the theme aligned a little bit more with my
Mm,
personal values. And so it's like, I can write stories that do meet my values and do click with that, but also have all of the elements that I really love in a
yeah.
story.
I can definitely say that's probably one of the biggest reasons a lot of young writers start to write is they like see in what they're reading and the TV shows they're watching and more like that. They start to notice things. So like they notice language, they notice sexual content, like more explicit content. And a lot of writers will be like, I don't really want to see that in my world. Like I want there to be an option for people who don't really want that. So I can definitely say
Mm-hmm.
that's why I started writing for sure because I'm a big romance reader. I love reading romance and I started writing romance when I was about 11 because that's when I started like getting into reading it. And it was very early on that I realized that there are a lot of not great romances out there. And so I was
Mm.
like, okay, you know what? I'm going to write one. And I did. And I have never looked back since. I really just love what I do. And I love getting to like make that kind of clean, safe content for like my nieces and nephews are all younger and like my future kids. Like I want that to be there. So yeah, I definitely can agree with that. Um,
I really love that introduction into the romance genre and just writing those good stories. Like,
yeah.
I love that.
It's definitely a challenge sometimes when you go into it because sometimes you can't find a ton of inspiration when there's so much like not great content in the world to read. And so you're kind of a lot of the time you're starting from scratch. But thankfully now there's a lot of young writers, a lot of Christian writers that have like gone through and written their own works and like done that like clean writing before. And so I can definitely say like Brian Davis, like Brett Harris, obviously we love Brett. And like you yourself, I loved reading your book. Lauren Hildebrand, just so many getting to see so many like creative writers and definitely getting to like talk to you guys and like get y'all's opinions on things has also helped like start that journey into writing more like clean, safe content for like kids and young adults. Um, Going into our next question for the day, which is we know that obviously you've written the Extension Squad, and I asked the same question of Josiah DeGraff when I did his episode, and you are free to say you don't want to share because you want to keep it secret. That's totally fine. But we had a friend ask, what are some of your like upcoming projects?
I think the project that will probably be released next, and it'll probably be released simultaneously with later volumes in the Extension Squad series, would be the Paladins of Astland series. It's going to be a high fantasy trilogy with some companion novellas as well. And it's about warring city states and traders and paladins and a hero who's already given up, and her adorable venomous war
Oh
rhino,
my gosh,
Spotty.
I'm so excited. I'm down. I'm like, you just gave me a loose description and I already want to read this. Um, which, by the way, I said this in our last episode with Josiah too, which I do this all the time. Definitely join Rachel's email list. It's worth it, definitely for sure. Um, which you can find that on her website, which I will link her website in the description of this episode so you guys can go check that out. And I will also be keeping updates on her work on the Inked podcast as well. So yeah, we will be looking forward to that. So our next question for today is, what is your biggest like piece of advice or like suggestions for young writers that may be trying writing for the first time, or even like mature writers that have been writing for a while but just feel like they're not going anywhere?
Mhm. I think one of the big things is to trust the process, because a lot of the time it can get really discouraging, especially if you're trying to write a whole entire novel. Like, most people in the world who say they want to write a novel never end up writing a novel, because writing a novel is actually really hard. And I've written 5 of them, I would know. It's difficult to get through it. It's a really long process, it's a tough process. And if you are only looking at completion of that draft as the thing keeping you going, then you're probably going to stall out after a couple of chapters. But if you trust the process and you set yourself small goals to keep yourself moving forward, that is a huge help in finishing that draft. And then, even once you've finished the draft, and even once you've done multiple drafts, it's still about trusting the process. Because when you finish a first draft, I mean, there's some people who make first drafts that are absolutely amazing, first try. I think they're probably superheroes or something. Most of us chumps have a pile of steaming slop at the end of our first draft. And then it's really about trusting the process through different edits. You know, most people have to do tons and tons of rounds of edits. There's writers out there who have to do 10 rounds of edits. A lot, it's closer to 5 rounds of edits in order to make an actually palatable story that could actually be sold. So understanding that it's not going to go super smoothly or super easily, but you don't need to be checking off every single box all the time. Instead, you need to be looking at that process and trusting the process and realizing, like, okay, yes, this is a pile of steaming garbage for now, but that won't be the case forever. And I just need to keep working one step at a time and not try to run an entire marathon in an after. Well, people do that in an afternoon, I guess. In an hour. You're not trying to run a marathon in an hour. You're trying to just
Mm-hmm.
take one step at a
Well,
time.
that is really real. I will definitely agree with Rachel on that. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of love to get your stories to where they need to be. So don't be discouraged if you write your first story and you're like, I really don't like this. That's totally fine. Trust the process. Keep going at it. That is something I will repeat throughout like this entire podcast. Is just keep trying. Keep trying. Like learn more, grow more, because the more you write and the more that you edit and the more that you just plot whatever you want to do, the more that you do that, the better you get at it. I can definitely say that was me. I struggled through my very first novel, which I actually just finished this year. I struggled through several short stories I did. So yeah, just keep going, guys. It's definitely worth it in the end. Thank
Congratulations on
you. It
finishing that
was on the
novel.
smaller end of a novel, but I'm proud of it. Now I'm procrastinating editing it, but that's fine. Um,
Absolutely.
Amen.
One step at a time.
Well, that is all the time we have for today. So thank you, Rachel, so much for being here. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having
I'm
me.
so
It's really
glad.
exciting to be here.
Well, that, like I said, that's all the time we have for today. And thank you, as always, to our listeners for being here for yet another episode of the Inked Podcast. And we will see you next time. Bye, guys.